Therapy for kids is a massive enterprise that goes largely unquestioned and accepted in our society. The consensus is that this is generally very good for kids and a very nice thing to do for them. And I don't think it's that simple at all. In fact, I think often therapy for kids is basically just abuse that we have a sort of collective unspoken agreement not to recognize as such. And I think that our lack of awareness and an honest discussion of this issue does a huge disservice to many kids, to many parents and families, and arguably to our society in general. In this video, I'd like to highlight one key dynamic when therapy for kids can become abuse, and that is when there's conflict between the kid and their environment. Now, my channel in general focuses a lot on this issue of conflict between kids and their environment, and in particular, what we can do, particularly once we become adults, coming out of this kind of thing in order to heal and grow. This issue of conflict between kids and their environment is something that, in my opinion, is extremely poorly understood, and often the way kids are managed is predicated on a certain denial or at least misunderstanding of this issue. And so often what happens is these mental health interventions happen on top of this misunderstanding, and the mental health professionals basically end up intervening in this situation, in that conflict, on the side of the adults against the kid. They basically become agents of the adults. They accept their premises, their narrative, and then they basically shape and brainwash the kid to accept this, forcing the kid to abandon their real perspective, abandon who they are. And then these kids become adults who don't know themselves very well, are very disconnected from themselves, disconnected from their feelings, and become somewhat wayward. And so basically these mental health interventions just end up perpetuating these cycles often of intergenerational trauma, you could say, even though they may tell themselves a narrative that is contrary to this. Now, this conflict between kids and their environment can look like different things. When there's more overt conflict between the kid and their environment, like when there's a lot of aggression going back and forth and a lot of kind of very much on the surface tension, the kid is often labeled as having behavior problems, or they're labeled with oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder or something like that. And when that happens, the adults can treat them in a way that is very callous and very aggressive, and they can become a kind of an object on which these adults can unload some of their very dark, disowned feelings. But I would argue that this conflict between kids and their environment, or perhaps what I should say is best understood as a conflict between kids and their environment, also happens when you have kids kind of shutting down in various ways, or maybe they're anxious, or they don't want to go to school, or they're very depressed. I think that often this can also have to do with conflict between kids and their environment. It's just coming out in a different way. And so you might ask, what is the source of this conflict between kids and their environment? Well, you could look at it as a mismatch between our real needs as human beings and what the environment is providing, and the fact that the environment is in denial. The environment doesn't want to reflect on these things, and it doesn't like it when other people surface the issues in the environment. So what might some of this mismatch between human needs and the environment look like? Well, I think a huge factor is school. This is something I've talked a lot about because it's so important, which is that our method of schooling, which is such a dominant force in our society, is something that is clearly not good for tons and tons of kids for a lot of different reasons that I've talked about and will continue to talk about. And yet we, again, have this sort of collective agreement that it must be good for kids. And if you question that, then people often really don't like it. And so if kids respond in a totally sane, normal way to schooling, we often say that they have something wrong with them. Another important example of a mismatch between our needs and the environment occurs in a lot of family systems. Many of us, unfortunately, are not growing up around people that are open-hearted, self-aware, self-reflective, critically thinking, well-integrated. And so we become affected by the things that they are bringing to us in our most vulnerable states. And it's hard to blame these adults that don't do this work because our culture, I would argue, is not one that really supports people well in doing this kind of deeper self-awareness work. And so what happens is the therapist often enters into the situation acting as an agent of the environment, often at a similar or worse level of unawareness and woundedness as the adults in the kid's immediate life. And then they act to program the kid to fit into that environment. And so when I experienced this kind of thing as a kid and as a teenager, I basically had to repress most of my real feelings, my real perspective, my real wants and needs, my own power. And yet I also had to buy into the adults' totally delusional narrative that what was happening was the opposite, that it was helping me become more aware and grow. And the mental health clinicians that I encountered had this very inauthentic demeanor, like this is what they were doing, when looking back on it, it's very clear that what they were really doing was about authoritarian control, repression, and maintenance of a very broken status quo. It was about maintaining unawareness because that's what the power structure around me demanded. And this is abuse because the goal is essentially the same as with other more overt types of abuse, like slapping the kid, social isolation, etc. So the goal is control, but it's presented as help. It has a similar effect as more overt abuse, but with an added layer of manipulation. And this kind of thing can obviously seriously damage people, but unfortunately, it's very easy to spin the effects of this damage as something being wrong with the individual, and the actual the situation gets decontextualized. The same thing happens with a lot of psychiatric medication and psychiatric labeling of kids, where the goal is basically the same as with beating kids, but it's presented as help. Now, another really scary thing that can happen with this dynamic is that it's almost like the totality of the child's world gets spun into this alternate reality created by the mental health clinician. So all of the problems created by the kid for this, the lack of self-trust, the anxiety, the depression, the hypervigilance, whatever it may be for the kid who then becomes an adult, all of that becomes framed as a defect in the individual kid, as opposed to something that arose out of a context where they were powerless to some extremely screwed up dynamics in which this mental health clinician essentially colluded against them. And a part of what makes this situation so insidious is that mental health professionals are our society's authority for making sense of these issues. And so we can really lose the truth of our experience and our lives because of how they are spinning things. And we may be unable to see that they are just a person with an opinion and a bunch of societal power that they are arguably abusing. Which is why I think that the kind of mental health authority that we have can be very problematic, because it can cause us to lose touch with our inner compass and lose touch with our real perspective about our lives. It's almost like they can become the ministry of truth over the most intimate aspects of our lives. Or at least that's what happened to me, and that's what can happen a lot of the time. So I wanted to explore this issue a bit, zeroing in on why exactly therapy can be sometimes best understood as abuse when it comes to kids, and what the kind of dynamics are occurring that are surrounding this. I'd love to know your experience with this in the comments. Please share this video with anybody who you think might find it valuable. Please also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end, and I look forward to having you for the next one.